La literatura norteamericana no puede imaginarse sin Toni Morrison, la gran escritora ganadora del Premio Nobel en 1993. Primera mujer en ganarlo desde hace 55 años y es la primera de ambos sexos, norteamericana, africana, que jamás lo haya recibido. Sus obras más importantes son The Bluest Eye, que puede traducirse como El ojo más azul, Song of Solomon, la canción de Salomón, Sula, Jazz, Tar Baby y Beloved, o Amada. Toni Morrison ha sido profesora de literatura en una multitud de universidades de los Estados Unidos y ha dado las conferencias Clark en Trinity College en Cambridge, Inglaterra, y las conferencias Massey en la Universidad de Harvard. Actualmente es profesora en Princeton, en donde tiene la cátedra George Gorgey. Toni Morrison es la ganadora del Premio Nobel 1993. Toni Morrison. You deal with very strong subject matter, and you make it stronger through language and imagination. What's more important for you, the subject matter or the way you deal with it?
Well, the subject matter has been handled by any number of people and in other forms, history as well as fiction. And I think my interest is probably connected to what I think perhaps may be the unique contribution, which is the language, the way in which content, which is really known in a certain way, becomes fresh, becomes new, becomes felt in a way it has not been felt before. And only language can do that.
How do you remember language when you were a child?
I'm not sure. There are two strands of language that seem to kiss or embrace in my life. One is music, because everybody in my family, and particularly my mother, sang all the time, all throughout the days. I woke up in the morning to the sound of her voice. And it was something less than entertainment. It was really communication. I knew how she felt, I knew her moods. I listened to the lyrics. Some were religious, some were classical, some were blues, some were sensual. And the other is books. So that I don't really remember myself, my consciousness, before I could read. So that combination of the sound of lyrics, the sound of poetry, spoken, and the stories we told and were told, plus my very early, fairly precocious familiarity with books.
How old were you when you began being interested in reading and letting your imagination go?
Well, the reading, I went, I think, formally to school around 5. And I must have started reading around 3.5 or 4. I had an older sister who probably taught me. I can remember us writing on the sidewalk. And when I first realized how to actually form words, and that was a word, instead of just copying signs. So that was extremely important. My imagination was always, I thought, fecund, it seems to me now, principally because this is pre-television, really pre-radio in a sense, where the entertainment really was whatever could be found or repeated among us, among the children, and the very close relationship that we had with our grandparents and my great-grandparents, because there was a lot of talking and shaping of tales and the repeating of them, family stories, jokes, ghost stories. Everything was anecdotal. And when you hear something, as opposed to see a television show, you are complicit in it. You have to imagine the colors for yourself, and you have to work at it. It's just a much more intimate relationship listening to a story than perhaps what's available to younger minds now.
Were you a happy child?
I guess so. At the time, I don't think I thought I was. I think I was loved, and I think I was nurtured, and I know I was healthy. But being a child, if you can really remember exactly what that vulnerability is, it's almost never happiness. It's always a little bit of apprehension because you're short and everybody else is tall, and they seem to know things and you don't. So when you look back on it as an adult compared to what one's responsibilities are now, it looks like ecstasy.
In your books, one finds complexity, terror, and love in the lives of African Americans.
It's, I suppose, a recipe for life. It's full of suffering and terror, and it's impossible not to know how close to the edge of the abyss we live, and what that process of devastation is. And it's also impossible not to really realize that what saves us, or what we hope saves us, is love. Trying to feel in some way sublime. And those things are the major ingredients. In my work, I'm just trying to carve away some of the detritus of racist language, racist stereotypes, the anonymity in which many African Americans have lived in literature, although not in their lives. And to make it fresh, as I said before, and clear, and also to give back to it, that is, to the culture, what the culture has provided, not just for me, but for everybody else. The music and the dance and the language and the style and the attitude, which for me is a mark of modernity. It's what separates the modern world from what went before in terms of its culture. And it has, been distributed all over the world. And to return to the culture something of its own magic and its own majesty, as well as its vulnerability, seemed to me to be a particularly worthy activity of my own art.
Toni, one gets the impression, reading a book like Beloved, that there is an invisible history of the United States and that you are writing it.
It's true. It's as though things I might have taken for granted because I grew up in the culture, that I realized that large numbers of people, black and white, were just completely unaware of. Because obviously the history books are written for the conquistador. The conqueror is the one who gets to tell the story of the nation, so that the people who have been conquered or who have had no voices are unheard. So if it's possible to rewrite it or turn it inside out so that you can look at it from when the gaze is entirely different, then you're right. One is really looking at an untold history, a buried one that is completely covert in many respects.
One of the first novels that deal with the subject of Black American people was The Invisible Man of Ralph Ellison, who just died last week. What made this book such a landmark novel?
The whole history of so-called slave narratives preceded it, which are autobiographical reports of a story about being enslaved and getting away and arriving at freedom. And then some contemporary 20s Harlem Renaissance novels, which seemed, and this is an overgeneralization, to be concerned primarily with the confrontation of between white and black in terms of assimilation, how to pass into the white race, how to deal with it, the problems of class. And then, of course, Richard Wright, who blasted some of the landscape with this extraordinary work. By the time Ralph Ellison had begun to write Invisible Man, it was 50s. You see, there was an entirely different kind of sensibility, a very complicated, very intricate, entangled experience was a black male experience in this country. It could not be simplified as it may have been overly simplified before by writers who had to please a certain kind of readership. So that giving the experience of being black in this country its due as an extremely existential, almost, extremely modern, very complicated experience and worldview was what made that so startling a book.
What has been the development of Black American culture?
Well, there was a period when James Baldwin, who wrote quite a bit, was a kind of a rapier, a sharper version, more verbal, more acid, clearer-eyed than perhaps even the material of Richard Wright when he came along in the 60s. And he was so powerfully articulate and so unblinking that it set up a whole plateau of expectation for subsequent writers. Following that, there was a great deal of civil rights, protest, confrontational novels. And then interspersed into that, some powerfully beautiful writing on the parts of the newer, younger writers who were poets and some women. And once the women began to compete with the men for pride of place in fiction, a lot changed. The subject matter changed, agendas changed all over. The language seemed to change. The most interesting thing that happened when the women began to write was that by and large, black women writers never wrote about white men. And everybody else did, because that was the ultimate rivalry, the ultimate confrontation, the ultimate gaze. So when I began to write, or Toni Cade Bambara began to write, and Paul Marshall, or Alice Walker, or even Maya Angelou, whatever the terrain, the focus was always on everything in the world but what white men thought about it. Now that may sound very simple, but it liberated the writing in such a way that it is impossible to describe. Once you took that man out of your material, there was this whole world available to you. And it was so enabling. And it has, I think, has made an enormous difference in the kinds of literature we get in the United States. And I don't think it was calculated, and it wasn't important. It was just that the women were looking for a language and activity that was primarily on their minds as women. And the men, even black men, were interested in the confrontational aspects of racism. So that all, now it's very ordinary. When I first began writing, when people said, when I wrote the Bluest Eye, I used to get questions all the time, yearning questions. Why are there no white people in your book? And I would think, and I said, well, yeah, there's some. Well, I mean, they're minor, but why don't you? So I thought perhaps that was just a quirk, but they asked me again in Song of Solomon, Sula. And a reviewer who liked Song of Solomon very much said that the absence of white people in Song of Solomon was a flaw. And that's fascinating to me because I could not say the same thing about his work or any other white writer. If they didn't put black people in their work, I would not consider that a deficiency. But when I wrote and there were no white people in my book, that was understood to be a deficiency.
Why?
Well, it's very complicated, I suppose, but the notion of black people being able to imagine themselves, narratize themselves, occupy the world, and occupy their whole lives without benefit of the white gaze seemed odd, because we had been understood to be objects, not subjects. But once in my work and in other work, we became the subjects of our own narrative, it may have appeared to people who had could not understand black except in terms of white. You know, it seemed bizarre at that time.
Many African American males believe that you portray them negatively. Are you aware of that?
Oh no, I think there's a little confusion about what negative treatment is. I think on the one hand they complain, some of them, 2 or 3, maybe 4, a great deal about my not drawing cutout pictures, sort of best foot forward, positive images, I think is the phrase they use. And I think it's demeaning to require of an artist that they write formulaic, positive images fiction. I mean, you get that in any cartoon or comic book. But more importantly, I think there was a kind of feeling of displacement, a gender battle, when many of the very bright young men began to write, and then suddenly they found themselves in competition with women, or young women also, and they felt as though there was some limited amount of terrain, which isn't true, but they felt that. And I could never find any group in which I'd been asked that question who could name over 10 women who they could name, who were writing. I was an editor at Random House, and I published fiction by black people as much as I could. And during 20 years, I published 15 black men and 3 black women. So that there is no equality at all in terms of number. But any assertion, I think, during that time on the part of women looked very much like an assault, and they were very much threatened by it. And I hope that that's no longer the case, but, you know, it will always sort of be there underneath, perhaps. But when you think of the treatment that black women have received in the novels of black men, it's ludicrous. I mean, think of Richard Wright, who practices abusing a black woman in order to learn how to abuse a white woman. I mean, it's amazing the kinds of literary treatments to which black women have been subject.
We always find in novels the theme of white men attracted to black women, but we never find the opposite, black women being attracted to white men.
I do know of some books that do that, but you're right, there are very few. That is few in literature, not few in life.
Of course, that's my yes.
I don't really know why that's not more examined. I do remember that there was a relationship between one of my characters and Tar Baby J. Dean, who had lived in Europe for a long time and was obviously married to or in love with or loved by a white European, and returns to him or returns to Europe at the end of the novel. But obviously the novel is about her difficult relationship with a black man who is a bit, different for her. But I don't know why that's not more explored. Sometimes you see mixed marriages, but the sort of relationship of black women to white men, it may be some political resistance to that. I mean, I don't know, but I would guess that it is a less attractive in literature. Now, it's very heavily explored on the soap operas. You know,
Yes.
they do it all the time. You know, in a way, there's a little bit ahead of everybody else in the soap operas. They talk about all sorts of things long before the...
I would like to know if when you were a young girl, when you were in your teens, if you ever discussed with other friends about some white boy that you liked or some white classmate that you were interested on.
I don't ever remember them. What I remember is black girls loving white movie stars
Oh, well,
and white singers. I mean, you know, it's very easy to say I love whomever, but not in real life. I don't remember in my girlhood or my childhood or even when I went away to college, any of that. I don't know. I think that came much later in the early 70s when it was much more common. Among my generation, black men had major priority for black women. White men were the people you went to when you couldn't get a good black man. It was a kind of a resignation on the part of the women. It may not have been that for the men. They may have understood white women as priorities, but that's because they're always worried about what white guys are thinking about them. It may have been, you know, that male thing they do. But I have friends who have married white men and had very successful and very productive marriages, but I do know that virtually all of them chose that marriage after a rebuff or a rejection or something that did not work with a black man. They were then not first. I don't think that's true any longer. I think it's much more mixed and people are much less uptight about those things now.
Your novel, The Bluest Eye, it's a beautiful novel. What made you write about that?
That girl.
Yes, that blind girl.
Well, it was sort of an autobiographical thing. Some little girl, when I was a child, somebody said that to me, a girl, was a friend of mine. We were about 9, I guess, or 10. And I just remembered looking at her wondering what on earth that was about. I mean, I just didn't have any language for it at that age, but I thought that it was a terrible thing for her to want. And I thought it was just unbelievable that she could actually pray for 2 years, every night, to have blue eyes. Much older, I thought about it in the context of what was going on politically. And I thought, there is something that I can only describe as racial. It's a psychosis, it's a social psychosis, and racism is a manifestation of it. Because it feels sort of crazy, actually. But it can be so easily reinforced and so become so natural and so common that you aren't aware of the true craziness of it. In addition to which, it hurts. It really hurts. And for people to think it is something you get over lightly, I thought it's possible if you're tougher, but some people don't get over that. Some people really feel, they internalize the contempt, they internalize the self-loathing, and that makes it impossible. And it's not the kind of thing that any group wishes to talk about, but I'm sure other groups experience that in different ways. I never went to school with there weren't a lot of black children in my school, but I remember white girls who had dark hair, who felt lesser because they did not have blonde hair and blue eyes. And they really were in that sort of dark Latin versus Nordic, and that's pervasive. And they understood it as a higher level of existence. And you take that into its extreme form with a little black girl who is totally defenseless if her family is not healthy and nurturing, if people are looking at her like she was an illness. And if she only wants to be something different so that anybody will look at her as though they welcome her, I mean, that's true madness, you see. And it's not that rare. And that's what provoked me into writing that book.
You just mentioned soap operas. And most of our culture is melodramatic in films and soap operas. But you strive for the tragic.
I don't want the easy shots. Melodrama is attractive and popular, and I enjoy it tremendously. But it's a little easy. It reduces things to the easiest emotions rather than the complexity of it. I don't want, and I almost never have, a good person who is not also stained by some vulnerability or corruption. And I never have a completely wicked person who is not endearing or charming in some way. And even when you have a historical fact, like the woman whose life I borrowed for Beloved, my creation of her, she does this absolutely terrible thing. But you cannot just dismiss her for that. And even if you understand the rationale for it, you may feel sympathy for her, but at the same time you're repelled by her. And it's not even just an either or, it's a much more complicated thing. And it's from that level that tragedy can come, from the level of that which is not pathos and not melodrama and not too simple. It has to do with agency, where the people know what they are doing. And in melodrama, they don't always know. They sort of fall in love, or they fall out of love, or fate is doing something to them. Or they cry a lot. And it's, it's satisfying in a certain way. But for me, it's a little bit more demanding than that. Life is a little bit more.
So, Toni, when are you coming to Mexico?
January 1995.
We'll be waiting for you there, and thank you very much. In Princeton, Silvia Lemus.